There are certain stories most of us could tell without even thinking. That Galileo Galilei was punished for proving the Earth revolves around the sun. That Pocahontas saved John Smith because she fell in love with him. That Isaac Newton discovered gravity when an apple hit him on the head. We learn them early. We repeat them easily, and they feel settled, like the facts are already agreed upon. But if you start to pull on any one of these stories, even a little bit, they don't fall apart dramatically, but they do start to shift. Details get blurry. Motives get simplified. Entire pieces quietly disappear. And what you're left with isn't exactly a lie. It's something cleaner than the truth, though. Something easier to understand. Something that works. So today, I want to walk through a few of those stories from the 1600s, not to debunk them or prove that everything we've learned is wrong, but to look at how and why these versions stuck in the first place. We're going to talk about how a scientist became a symbol, how a real person became a myth, and how one of the most famous geniuses in history became a much simpler version of himself. Because the more you look at these stories, the more a pattern starts to emerge. Not about what happened, but about how we chose to remember. So let's rewind and let's get into it. It's 1633, and Galileo Galilei is standing in a room where he can probably already feel the direction this is heading. The atmosphere doesn't feel curious. Nobody's there to openly wrestle with ideas or suddenly abandon deeply held beliefs because they heard a compelling argument. The room feels procedural, almost administrative, like the machinery has already been set in motion and everyone involved understands the role they're expected to play. Galileo is 69 years old at this point. His health has declined. He's exhausted from years of work and controversy, and after decades spent building his reputation as one of Europe's most influential thinkers, he now finds himself standing in front of the Roman Inquisition, fully aware that his standing in the world may be about to change permanently. And I think the way we picture this moment in hindsight is important because most of us inherited an extremely dramatized version of this story. We imagine a fiery showdown between science and religion, almost like two giant opposing forces colliding in a single room while one brave genius stands alone against ignorance. And when you actually look at what was happening historically, the situation feels quieter than that, more controlled and more political. Honestly, more human, which to me makes it more interesting. By the time Galileo arrives in Rome, the issue is no longer simply whether the Earth moves around the sun. The idea had already existed for quite a while. Nicholas Copernicus had proposed heliocentrism decades earlier, and there were astronomers and mathematicians and clergy all across Europe actively discussing how the universe actually worked. The church was not some monolithic anti-science machine where nobody studied astronomy. That part gets flattened in a lot of modern retellings. In reality, many educated church officials were deeply interested in science and mathematics. Universities connected to the church taught astronomy. Jesuit scholars were making astronomical observations themselves. The tension came from somewhere more complicated than science versus religion. The real problem was why Galileo pushed the conversation publicly, and the fact that he kept pushing it long after he understood where the boundaries were. That distinction matters because Galileo is not naive in this story. He already knows what the risks are. Back in 1616, church authorities had warned him not to hold or defend heliocentrism as fact. So by the time he publishes Dialogue Concerning the Two Chief World Systems in 1632, he understands perfectly well that people are going to scrutinize it closely, which makes the tone of the book fascinating. On paper, the dialogue presents itself as a balanced intellectual discussion between three characters debating competing models of the universe. One supports the traditional Earth-centered view, another supports the sun-centered model, and the third moves between the positions, asking questions. It sounds fair enough in theory, but once you actually read it, it becomes very obvious where Galileo stands. One character comes across as thoughtful and persuasive. Another feels genuinely curious and intellectually flexible. And then there's Simplicio, the defender of the traditional model who repeatedly ends up sounding confused and simplistic and embarrassingly behind the conversation. Even the name feels pointed. Simplicio, as in simple. And this is where the situation starts shifting away from a purely intellectual disagreement into something much more personal and political, because Pope Urban VIII had actually been relatively supportive of Galileo before this. He wasn't automatically hostile to him. In fact, he had allowed the discussion to continue under certain conditions. One of those conditions was that Galileo include the church's position fairly and acknowledge that some questions about the universe might ultimately sit beyond complete human uncertainty. Now, Galileo technically does that. The problem is that the argument associated with the Pope's own perspective ends up in the mouth of Simplicio. And whether Galileo intended it this way or not, the result created the impression that the Pope himself was being made to look foolish in a widely circulated intellectual work. That changes the temperature of the situation very quickly. And this is where I think modern retelling sometimes oversimplify things too aggressively, because the church was not reacting in isolation here. Europe was already destabilized by the Protestant Reformation. Religious authority was under pressure everywhere. Questions that may have once stayed confined to scholars and theologians were now spilling into public life in ways institutions were struggling to control. So, when Galileo publicly pushes an idea that appears to challenge accepted understanding, the anxiety underneath the reaction becomes much larger than astronomy. If one major accepted truth can suddenly shift, then people start wondering where else authority might be wrong. And once that kind of questioning spreads publicly, institutions lose the ability to decide where the line is supposed to stop. That doesn't mean the church's response was justified, but historically, it makes the situation easier to understand than the very clean, smart guy versus dumb institution version most of us inherited. Because reality is usually messier than that. So when Galileo is eventually called to Rome, this isn't some random overreaction that comes out of nowhere. It's the endpoint of years long tension building between personality and politics and ego and public perception and genuine disagreement about where the boundaries of authority actually are. And the actual trial reflects that complexity, I think. One of the biggest misconceptions people carry about this story is the idea that the proceedings are centered on proving whether heliocentrism is scientifically true. That's not really what's happening here. The core issue is whether Galileo violated the earlier warning he had already received in 1616. Did he cross the line he had been told not to cross? That question sits underneath almost every interaction that follows. And the proceedings themselves are surprisingly controlled. This isn't a dramatic courtroom argument with sweeping speeches and emotional declarations. Galileo is questioned over multiple sessions, and the structure of those questions tells you a lot about what the church is actually trying to accomplish. Nobody is asking him philosophical questions about the cosmos. They're asking him to account for his behavior. Why did you publish this book? Why does it read the way it reads? Why does it appear that you're defending an idea you were explicitly warned not to defend? And Galileo answers carefully. You can almost feel him trying to navigate the situation in real time. He leans heavily on technicalities and insists that he merely presented both sides of the argument for discussion. He claims he never explicitly endorsed one position over the other. Clever, which is not especially convincing if you've actually read the book. But his responses reveal something important psychologically. At this point, Galileo is no longer trying to win an intellectual debate. He's trying to survive the situation he's in. And that changes the emotional texture of the story quite a bit. Because the simplified version most of us learn turns him into this permanently defiant figure who never bends. But the historical reality feels much more human than that. He's elderly. He's under enormous institutional pressure. He understands exactly who he's dealing with and what they're capable of doing. At one point, the possibility of torture is formally introduced into the proceedings. It never actually was carried out, but the fact that it enters the conversation at all changes the atmosphere immediately. Now, the situation carries physical implications too. And even through the formal language of the records, you can feel what the process is trying to accomplish. The goal isn't really to debate Galileo into agreement. The goal is to move him into compliance. Eventually, under that pressure, Galileo recants. And when that moment happens, it's not dramatic in the cinematic way people often imagine. It's formal and structured and ritualized. He's made to kneel. A prepared statement is placed in front of him, and he reads it aloud publicly, formally, and rejecting the position he had spent years building and defending. Quote, with a sincere heart and unfeigned faith, I abjure, curse, and detest. That language is intense. It goes far beyond saying, I was mistaken. The statement demands complete renunciation. And honestly, I think this is the part of the story that people tend to rush past because it complicates the myth we prefer. Because this isn't triumphant in terms of what kind of a moment it was, it's negotiated. You're watching someone calculate the cost of continuing to push against a system far larger than himself and deciding publicly that he can't keep absorbing that pressure indefinitely. That feels very different from the version most of us learned growing up. There's also the famous line you've probably heard attached to this story, quote, "and yet it moves," supposedly whispered by Galileo after his recantation, almost like this final cinematic act of rebellion. The problem is that there's no reliable evidence he actually said that. The quote doesn't appear in written accounts until decades later, which honestly feels almost perfect for this episode because even the most iconic and emotionally satisfying moments attached to Galileo's story may have been added afterward by people who wanted to have the story land a certain way. After the trial, Galileo is sentenced to house arrest for the remainder of his life. And what we consider house arrest sounds deceptively mild when you say it quickly, but this becomes the entire structure of his remaining years. His movement is restricted. His communication changes. His world narrows considerably. At the same time, his physical condition continues deteriorating. His eyesight worsens until he eventually goes completely blind. And there's something about that period of his life that becomes much more emotionally interesting the longer you sit with it. Because for most of his career, Galileo's authority came from observation, from seeing, from looking through a telescope and trusting what was physically in front of him enough to challenge established understanding. And now, at the end of his life, that ability disappears entirely. But the work continues. He dictates ideas to assistants and he writes through other people. He continues refining concepts that will influence physics long after his death. But not with the same public force as before, not through direct confrontation, but persistently, quietly. And that quieter version of Galileo is probably closer to the real person than the mythologized version most of us inherited later. Because when you stop reducing him to a symbol for a minute, what emerges is someone deeply complicated, brilliant, obviously, but also proud and competitive and public facing. Sometimes a little reckless, someone who clearly understood how persuasion worked and who also seemed to care very much about recognition. And honestly, I think part of why the story survives the way that it does is because people prefer symbols to contradictions. If you look at how Galileo was written about shortly after his death in 1642, there isn't immediate agreement about who he was or what his story means. Some admire him enormously. Others think he created unnecessary conflict. Some view him as courageous, while others see him as provocative in ways that made the entire situation worse. He's still being interpreted. It's really later, especially during the Enlightenment, that the image begins hardening into something cleaner and more symbolic. At that point, Galileo becomes incredibly useful to thinkers trying to position reason and institutional authority as opposing forces. So the story gradually gets distilled into a version that supports that framework. Over time, the rougher edges start disappearing. The ego softens. The political complexity fades. The historical context gets compressed. And eventually, what survives most strongly is a story about a lone genius standing against oppression in pursuit of truth, which isn't entirely inaccurate. It's just a little incomplete. And the interesting thing is that Galileo's image keeps evolving long after his death. In the 19th century, he becomes a warning about institutional overreach. In the 20th century, his story gets pulled into larger conversations about science and religion. Even today, people still invoke Galileo anytime there's an argument about expertise or censorship or who gets to define reality. By that point, though, most of the details of his actual life have faded into the background. What remains is the version that best fits the moment, which means Galileo isn't just someone history remembers, he's someone history keeps rewriting. And honestly, there's one question sitting underneath all of this that I can't stop thinking about. If Galileo had been quieter, if he'd been more cautious politically, more restrained publicly, more willing to avoid direct confrontation, there's a decent chance none of this escalates the way that it does. He probably avoids the trial entirely. But then I also wonder whether we would even remember him the same way if he had played it safer. because part of what made him historically unforgettable was the fact that he kept pushing publicly long after it became dangerous to do so, which means the thing that made him vulnerable is probably also the thing that made it impossible to forget. And once you start looking at the story through that lens, it stops feeling like a simple conflict between truth and power. It starts feeling like something much more human than that. At almost the exact same time that Galileo Galilei is being questioned in Rome, there's a completely different kind of story unfolding across the Atlantic. No formal trial or written recantation, no room full of officials deciding whether someone crossed a line they weren't supposed to cross. And yet, in a strange way, this story ends up becoming just as shaped by the people who recorded it. Maybe even more, because almost everything we know about Pocahontas comes to us filtered through English accounts, English priorities, and English interpretations of events they themselves didn't fully understand. And once you realize that, the entire story starts feeling less stable. In 1607, John Smith is moving through territory the English barely understand, and more importantly, don't control. Jamestown has only recently been established, and the colony itself is struggling badly, and the relationship between the settlers and the Powhatan Confederacy is still being negotiated in real time. And the Powhatan Confederacy is important to understand here because I think a lot of people subconsciously picture Native groups during this period as scattered or disconnected, when in reality, Powhatan was overseeing a large political network with hierarchy and diplomacy and alliances and systems of authority the English were trying to navigate without fully understanding them. Eventually, Smith is captured and brought into that world, and this is where the story most people recognize begins to take shape, or at least the version of it that survives later. Because in Smith's earlier writings, the ones produced closer to the actual events themselves, he describes tension, uncertainty, and fear. He describes being moved between villages and brought before Powhatan leadership without really knowing what's going to happen to him. What's interesting is that the dramatic rescue story most people know today isn't there yet. There's no moment that we know of where Pocahontas throws herself over him to save his life. That part appears later, years later, after Smith is back in England, after Pocahontas herself has become known to English society, after enough time has passed for the story to start hardening into something much more dramatic and emotionally recognizable. And in that later version, the scene becomes incredibly vivid. Smith describes his head being placed on stones while men stand over him preparing to execute him. He says Pocahontas intervenes in the last second, throwing herself over him and stopping the execution. And honestly, it's easy to understand why that version survives. It feels pretty dramatic. You can visualize it instantly. It gives the audience a clear emotional entry point and establishes Pocahontas as a recognizable figure within the story instead of someone moving around its edges. But the more context you add, the stranger and more uncomfortable the scene starts to feel, because Pocahontas at this point is likely around 10 or 11 years old, and that detail changes the emotional framework of the entire story immediately. Once you know her age, the way later retellings romanticize or dramatize the relationship starts feeling very different. You stop picturing a mature woman consciously stepping into a mythic role, and you start picturing a child existing inside an enormous political and cultural collision she didn't create and almost certainly did not understand. And historians have spent a long time trying to untangle what Smith may have actually experienced during this encounter. Some scholars believe that the event wasn't even an attempted execution, but rather some kind of ritual or ceremonial incorporation into Powhatan's society. In that interpretation, the threat and the rescue may have carried symbolic meaning Smith simply didn't understand at the time, which honestly, that makes sense to me because when people move between cultures without shared frameworks, they often interpret unfamiliar rituals through whatever language or narrative structure already feels recognizable to them, and that possibility changes the entire texture of the story. Now, instead of asking whether Pocahontas literally saved John Smith's life, you start asking something much more complicated. How much of history is shaped by people trying to describe situations they don't get while they're living through them? And then there's another layer underneath all of this that I think matters just as much. We don't have Pocahontas's voice in any of this. I mean, at all. We know she visited Jamestown. We know she brought food to settlers during periods when the colony was struggling. And we know she interacted with the English repeatedly during those early years. But when you go looking for her thoughts, her interpretation of events, or her understanding of what these relationships meant, The historical record becomes almost completely silent. And that absence matters more than I think we usually acknowledge, because when only one side of the cultural encounter is extensively documenting events, they aren't just recording what happened, they're also controlling the framework people later use to understand it. So now we've inherited the English interpretation of the story. And once you notice that, it becomes impossible to fully unsee, because there's a difference between having an incomplete history and having history where one side has vastly more power to define what the story would eventually become. As the years pass, the relationship between the English settlers and Powhatan's people deteriorates badly. What may have been initially looked like cautious diplomacy gradually gives way to mistrust and violence and competing attempts to control territory and resources. And somewhere inside that unraveling relationship, Pocahontas herself is captured. Even the mechanics of that feel less dramatic and more unsettling than people usually imagine. She isn't seized in some massive cinematic battle sequence. She's effectively lured into an English ship during negotiations and then prevented from leaving. She becomes leverage, a bargaining tool inside a much larger political struggle. And during this period, another transformation starts taking place around her. She's baptized into Christianity and given the name Rebecca. And this is one of those details that feels small until you really sit with it. Because once someone's name changes inside of a historical record, the entire framing around them often changes too. Matoaka becomes Pocahontas. Pocahontas becomes Rebecca Rolfe. And with each shift, you can almost watch the English colonial narrative gradually reorganizing her into a form that feels more legible and useful to them. Eventually, somewhere around 16 or 17, she marries John Rolfe. And again, the historical reality feels much more complicated than the softened version most people inherited later, because Rolfe actually writes about the marriage himself, and his language doesn't really read like someone overwhelmed by romance. He frames the relationship in terms of religious duty and political stability and the advancement of the colony, which doesn't necessarily mean there was no genuine human connection there, but history is usually more emotionally complicated than that. But it does tell you how the marriage was being understood publicly and politically at the time. And once you read those writings directly, it becomes harder to maintain the very clean love story people often default to. A few years later, in 1616, Pocahontas is brought to England. And this is one of the rare moments where we can actually see how she was being presented to the world visually, because an engraving of her is produced during this period. She's dressed in English clothing, of course, and posed according to English standards of presentation and status, and identified not primarily as Matoaka or even Pocahontas, but as Rebecca Rolfe. And the image itself feels incredibly revealing once you look at it. She's being presented to English society as evidence that colonialization is working, that indigenous people can be converted and reshaped and incorporated and absorbed into English cultural systems successfully. And then, almost as suddenly as she enters English public life, she's gone. In 1617, while preparing to return to Virginia, Pocahontas becomes ill and dies at roughly 21 years old. The exact cause remains uncertain. Some historians suspect pneumonia or tuberculosis, or others point to infectious diseases more broadly, especially considering how vulnerable indigenous populations often were to illnesses introduced through European contact. Honestly, there's something deeply unsettling about how short her documented life actually is once you strip away the mythology surrounding it. Because when most people picture Pocahontas culturally, they imagine someone larger than life, a fully formed historical symbol, someone who existed in public memory for decades. But the real person at the center of all this dies extraordinarily young. And after that, the story increasingly belongs to other people. Over time, the sharper edges start softening. The captivity becomes less central. The imbalance of power gets a little quieter. And the uncertainty fades. And eventually, what survives most strongly is a version of the story centered around connection and understanding and emotional reconciliation between worlds, which is a much easier story to teach, much easier to repeat, and much easier to emotionally live with. But it also leaves out many of the things that made the historical reality feel human and unstable in the first place. Because the real story is full of incomplete understanding and competing motivations and translation gaps. And I think that's the part that stays with me the most. Not just how the story changed over time, but how much of the original complexity disappeared because later generations needed the story to resolve more cleanly than real life usually does. So by the time we get to Isaac Newton, the story doesn't really get sharpened into conflict the way Galileo's does, and it doesn't get softened into emotional reconciliation the way Pocahontas' story does. Instead, it gets compressed, distilled down into something so clean and efficient that it almost stops feeling human altogether. Most people carry around the same version of the same image: Newton sitting beneath a tree and an apple falls. And suddenly, one of the most important scientific breakthroughs in history just clicks into place. And it's neat and instantaneous and weirdly comforting. And honestly, it's probably one of the most successful historical stories ever created because it explains something extraordinarily complicated in about 10 seconds. You don't need to understand physics to understand an apple falling, right? You don't need to know calculus or orbital mechanics or centuries of scientific development to feel like you get the basic idea, which is probably exactly why the story survives so well. But once you start looking at Newton's actual life, it becomes obvious almost immediately. But once you start looking at Newton's actual life, it becomes obvious almost immediately that the reality was much messier and stranger and much more psychologically complicated than the version most of us inherited. Newton is born in 1643 under circumstances that don't exactly suggest future greatness. He's premature and physically fragile and reportedly so small at birth that people doubted he would survive at all. His father dies before he's born, and when his mother remarries, she leaves him behind to be raised largely by his grandparents. And by most accounts, that early abandonment affects him deeply. People who wrote about Newton throughout his life repeatedly describe someone intensely inward and isolated and obsessive and often difficult socially. He doesn't come across as naturally charismatic or emotionally balanced. He comes across as someone who spends enormous amounts of time inside his own head. At one point, he even creates a written list of his personal sins. And that's incredibly revealing because it doesn't sound like the calm, detached personality we tend to associate with him culturally now. The list includes things like threatening to burn down his mother's house with her inside, striking other people, having violent thoughts, obsessing over moral and spiritual failures. And reading that list feels a little unsettling because suddenly Newton stops feeling like a polished historical monument and starts sounding like an actual human being struggling with anger and insecurity, which is very different emotional framework than a quiet genius discovers gravity after seeing an apple. When Newton eventually arrives at Cambridge, he's not immediately treated like some obviously world changing intellect either. And one of the things I think modern people would find most surprising is how much of his life is devoted to subjects that now sound completely disconnected from science altogether: alchemy, biblical prophecy, ancient temple measurements, theological interpretation. He spends enormous amounts of time trying to decode hidden truths buried inside scripture and ancient systems of knowledge. In fact, he actually writes more about theology and alchemy than he does about physics or mathematics. That was really surprising to me. And that detail tends to disappear from simplified versions of his life because it doesn't fit comfortably into the modern image of rational scientific genius. But during Newton's lifetime, those categories weren't as cleanly separated as they are now. People weren't walking around thinking in terms of science versus mysticism in the way we do today. To Newton, these pursuits were just connected attempts to understand the hidden structure of reality. And honestly, I think removing that part of him changes the story more than people realize. The simplified version makes it seem like Newton was operating with modern certainty before modern science even fully existed, when in reality, he was still moving through a world where intellectual boundaries were much blurrier and where many people believed truth was scattered across religion, mathematics, nature, and ancient knowledge simultaneously. Then in 1665, the plague hits England and Cambridge temporarily shuts down. Newton returns home, and this period later becomes mythologized as his Year of Wonders, the stretch of time where he supposedly develops calculus and begins forming ideas about gravity and lays the foundation for major breakthroughs in optics. And to be fair, this period is really important. He does make extraordinary progress during these years, but the way later generations retell it compresses the process so aggressively that it starts sounding almost supernatural. Years of thinking become a moment, Gradual development becomes sudden realization, and eventually, all of it collapses into the apple story. Now, to be clear, the apple itself probably isn't entirely fictional. Newton later describes watching an apple fall and thinking seriously about why objects move the way they do. Why downward? Why consistently? Why would the same force that pulls an apple toward the ground not also extend outward toward the moon? Those questions mattered enormously. But even in Newton's own recollections, the apple isn't presented as some magical instant where gravity suddenly reveals itself fully formed. It's the beginning of a line of thinking, a prompt, a question that unfolds over years. And I think the more you look at Newton's life, the more obvious it becomes that the process, not sudden genius, is actually what defined him. Because Newton is constantly revising and withholding and obsessing and recalculating and competing, especially competing. One of the clearest examples of this is his long running conflict with Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz over the invention of calculus. And this isn't some small academic disagreement that quietly unfolds. It becomes deeply personal and incredibly bitter. Both men appear to have developed versions of calculus independently, and instead of that becoming a fascinating example of simultaneous discovery, the entire thing devolves into a fight over intellectual ownership and recognition. Who thought of it first? Who deserves credit? Who gets remembered as the true originator? And Newton becomes intensely protective of his position. By this point, he's president of the Royal Society, which means he also occupies a position of institutional authority while the dispute unfolds. Eventually, a report is issued supporting Newton's claim to priority. What readers weren't told at the time is that Newton himself heavily shaped the report behind the scenes. And again, this is one of those details that tends to disappear from simplified retellings because it just complicates the image. The real version looks much more like somebody deeply concerned with reputation and ownership and criticism and historical legacy, which honestly makes him feel more recognizable, not smaller, but just more human. There's nothing wrong with that. There's other moments like this throughout his life, too. At one point, criticism of his work in optics affects him so strongly that he largely withdraws from public scientific debate for a period of time. He becomes increasingly cautious about publishing and increasingly sensitive to intellectual attacks. Later in life, Newton's position changes dramatically. He oversees the Royal Mint, becoming a major public figure. He's knighted, and eventually turns into something much larger than an individual scientist. By the time he dies in 1727 and is buried in Westminster Abbey, the burial itself feels symbolic. This isn't just society honoring a person anymore, it's institutional canonization. Newton has become part of Britain's intellectual identity. And once someone reaches that level historically, the rougher edges of their personality almost always begin fading into the background. The alchemy becomes less important. The theological obsessions become a little less visible. The rivalries definitely soften. What survives most strongly is the version that works best culturally, the lone genius, the singular breakthrough, the apple. Because that version does something really useful. It turns intelligence into a story people can emotionally process. It creates a clean origin point for ideas that are actually staggeringly complicated. And maybe more importantly, it makes discovery feel intuitive, like it's almost accessible. Like history moves forward because one brilliant person notices something everyone else missed. But the real development of knowledge almost never works that way. It's usually a lot slower and more collaborative, more uncertain, and more messy. And Newton's actual life reflects that much more honestly than the simplified version does. Now, forgive me for going on to a historiography soapbox, but there's this assumption baked pretty deeply into the way most of us learn history, and honestly, I don't think we question it too often. We tend to assume that you start with the simple version of a story as a child, and then over time, you gradually move closer to the full complexity of what actually happened. Almost like historical understanding naturally deepens as you get older, right? You hear the introductory version first, and eventually somebody comes back later and says, okay, now that you're older, here's what was really going on underneath all that. And I think most of us sort of believe that process exists, even if we've never consciously thought about it, because it makes intuitive sense. You wouldn't hand a 10-year-old the full psychological and political and moral complexity of every historical event immediately. you'd give them a version they could actually hold on to first, right? Something memorable or something that sticks. The more I thought about these stories, the less interested I became in whether the simplified versions were technically wrong, because honestly, simplification itself may be unavoidable. Human beings need narrative structure. We need memorable shapes. We need ways to organize information emotionally, or most of it just disappears. I totally get that. A 10-year-old probably shouldn't be handed the full psychological and political complexity of Galileo's trial, right? You start with the broad outline first. Same with Newton and Pocahontas. Same with almost every historical figure we learn about. That part does make sense to me. What feels stranger is that we often never return for the second layer. There's a psychologist named Jerome Bruner who argued that learning is supposed to happen recursively. You introduce ideas in simpler forms first, and then you revisit them over time, adding complexity, contradiction, and nuance as people mature intellectually. In theory, that's how history education should work. You start with the outline. Then later, you revisit it again and realize the story is even messier than you originally thought, almost like adding layers to a painting. But I don't think most people experience history that way. I think for a lot of us, the first layer quietly becomes the permanent one. And once that happens, something subtle changes in the way we understand the past. History starts feeling inevitable. People in the past start feeling more certain than they actually were. Events start feeling cleaner and resolved and more emotionally organized. But the deeper you go into almost any historical moment, the more uncertainty you find. You find a lot of people improvising and misunderstanding each other and working with incomplete information. They're trying to just maintain status or survive pressure or interpret situations they can't fully see yet, which honestly feels a lot more recognizable. And I think that recognition matters because once you realize historical figures were usually just as confused as we were, history stops feeling like a collection of finished morality tales. It starts feeling like an ongoing human process. And maybe that's the real danger of oversimplifying stories for too long. It doesn't just flatten the past, it changes the way we interpret the present. Because if you grow up believing history is always obvious in hindsight, you start assuming major events should feel obvious while they're happening too. But they usually don't. They probably feel messy and emotionally unresolved while people are inside them, just like they did for the people we spent this episode talking about. And honestly, maybe the goal isn't to eliminate simplified stories completely. I mean, without them, most people would never engage with history at all. Maybe the real responsibility is making sure we circle back, making sure people know there is another layer waiting underneath the first one. Because the first version of the story is almost always the easiest one to remember, but it doesn't have to be the last one we understand. Thanks for listening to this again. I'm Mallory Faust, and if this episode made you rethink a story you thought you already understood, send it to someone who might still be on the first version. I'll see you next time.